Welcome to another episode of Complete Developer Podcast, the podcast by coders for coders about all aspects of creating your best life as a developer.
I'm Will, the accomplished developer and aspiring software architect.
And I'm Beej, the journeyman developer, sharing my journey in development.
Complete Developer Podcast is supported by listeners like you. We are now on Patreon at www.patreon.com/Complete Developer Podcast. This episode is brought to you by Datadog.
Debt collectors are calling, leaving threatening voicemails, and sending letters saying they will take legal action soon. Hopefully, you've never been in that situation. It's possible and almost necessary to have to take on some debt within your lifetime. And that doesn't mean that it has to be a problem. In this episode, we're going to define technical debt and talk about what it is, how it comes about, and different ways to pay it off. But before we get started, Will, what have you been fighting this week?
I'm fighting my shoulder right now. Sorry, right as you were talking, I just shifted my shoulder to pop it, and it hurt really bad. Took my breath there for a second. This past week, I've been working a lot. We've got a release coming out, and fixing bugs in that. We've got stuff that's gotten deployed to client sites, and they've got custom pieces. I'm having to jump onto that stuff. Got caught up on emails and stuff. I got ahead on all the emails for the podcast. Got ahead on writing outlines a little bit. Not completely done with one, but ahead of where I normally am. So I've just been working like a dog here lately. Like this past weekend, I worked all day Saturday, and then I ended up yesterday basically running around all day running errands. Mm-hmm. I didn't get to do very much of anything this weekend, so I'm a little tired. That's basically it. I still got to keep going until at least Friday night, and then I can oversleep Saturday morning and then developer launchpad.
Yeah, well.
But I'm looking forward to that oversleeping, is what I'm saying. How about you?
Well, I've been doing some mentoring and tutoring recently. It's kind of fun to see how the people that I'm working with have different ways of learning, and sometimes it's a challenge to explain a concept that to me makes perfect sense. But I know when I was learning, there were things that just did not click right away for me, and it took a while for me to get. So I try to explain it in multiple different ways until they kind of get a little bit. And the hardest part, I guess, is understanding that they may not get it right away, and it has to ruminate for a bit. Because I want people to get it, to understand what I'm saying right here, right now. And that's not always the case.
Yeah, that's always been my weak spot too when I'm trying to help people is I get into over-explaining things a little bit. And sometimes, stuff sticks better when you get them 30% of the way and they get the other 70.
Yeah.
Because now they own it. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. It's a problem I run into as well. And it's hard to beat that. Mm.
So I finally joined the modern world and upgraded my phone. I now have an iPhone 8, and the only one that they had in black was the 256 gigabytes. So, I got more storage space on my phone than on the SSD on my laptop. Now, the laptop does have a regular hard drive that has more, but it's interesting not needing to worry about storage space, as my last phone, it had about as much storage as this laptop has memory. And most of that was taken up by iOS.
Yeah.
Speaking of the new iPhone, there's an interesting app that I'm going to talk about this week for IoTs. For those of y'all that upgraded earlier than me, you probably already know about this, but for the rest of us Luddites and the Android users in the crowd, when I got my new iPhone, it came with an app called Home. This is Apple's built-in control for your smart home accessories. It has the tagline, one app for all of your home accessories. And they make it clear that this is to be the intended app for IoT. Though they do have a limited number of accessories because each one is reviewed and approved by Apple to help ensure security. And with Apple's dedication to security and restrictions on what they'll let even into their app store, I'm kind of excited to find out more about it and play with this app. I'll have to find some accessories that are compatible with both the Apple and Amazon's Alexa Echo. So if there isn't one already, I'll probably be compiling a list.
I think some of the guys on MS Dev Show were talking about that, and there's some kind of little deal that you can rig up that will actually forward requests to the other one.
Oh, neat.
So you might be able to like proxy it some way, you know.
I haven't listened to their most recent show, so I'll have to check that out. That's awesome.
It was one a while back. I think it was MS Dev Show. I'd have to look again. It's that time of year again. BJ and I are getting ready for Nashville's premier polyglot technology conference. This year, Music City Code has combined forces with Music City Agile and Music City Data, and by their powers combined, they form Music City Tech.
Have you ever wondered what it's like to record a podcast? Sit in the audience as we host a panel at the conference that will later, through the magic of editing, become an episode. Meet us and the Junior Developer Toolbox crew at our booth and get some really cool complete developer swag.
Music City Tech is a 3-day event, May 31st through June 2nd, consisting of simultaneous conferences, Music City Code, Music City Agile, and Music City Data, each focused on a particular community of technology professionals, held at Vanderbilt University. Music City Tech is announcing the selected sessions this week. Beej will be one of them. Tickets go on sale April 1st with early bird pricing at 50% off. Attendees can register at completedeveloper.musiccitytech.com.
Who's talking to us this week?
Well, we grabbed a Facebook comment from Lucas Rodriguez. Said, why usually JavaScript books/courses are JavaScript plus jQuery? I know jQuery is easier, but you aren't learning JS that way. Any recommendations for somebody who wants to learn really vanilla JavaScript? Thanks.
Thanks, Lucas. Now, Will kind of addressed this in our live feed last week, but we thought it would be a good question to discuss with the entire audience.
I guess the way I would start with this is jQuery is easier, and it gets around a lot of the bad old days of JavaScript. I don't know that it's entirely necessary now. That said, it does seem like most of the tutorials kind of seem to start there, which I find very strange.
Well, a lot of your older developers don't really know the difference between JavaScript and jQuery because they were taught.
They don't use it alone.
Yeah.
It's like me with Visual Studio and ReSharper. I couldn't tell you what the Visual Studio shortcut key is for some things because I've got another layer on top that I use. I will say that you can learn a lot of really slick vanilla JavaScript digging through the jQuery code, not the minified one, not like the regular jQuery code, the raw open source code. I wish that more tutorials were vanilla JavaScript. I do think you should start there and then you should go to jQuery. When you were interning here, that's what we did because I didn't want you to be dependent on, some library.
Until I built some really crazy stuff in vanilla JavaScript and you're like, that you could just do that real easily with jQuery. I'm like, you told me I wasn't allowed to use that.
Yeah. Well, you got to a point too where it was like, okay, he's capable of doing the more complex stuff. And then, okay, now let's do this in a cleaner, easier to maintain way.
Yeah. I will say W3 Schools has some really good vanilla JavaScript tutorials and just basic information on JavaScript because they actually do separate JavaScript and jQuery.
Yeah, and I would imagine Pluralsight has got quite a few as well.
Probably so, yeah. And again, thanks, Lucas, for participating on our Facebook Live and asking this really great question. Send us a message or email with your contact information because we've got a Complete Developer water bottle just for you. And guys, if you'd like your very own Complete Developer water bottle, leave us a review in iTunes or comment on the website or any of our social media. We post all our episodes to Twitter, Facebook, Google+, and LinkedIn. We're also on Instagram, Path, and Tumblr. You can check us out each week on Facebook and Twitter Live and Periscope, where every Monday evening we talk about what's going on in the tech world and answer some listener questions. Join the conversation anytime via Slack by going to slack.completedevelopernetwork.com.
A thank you to our sponsor, Datadog, a cloud monitoring platform bringing full visibility to dynamic infrastructure and applications. Create beautiful dashboards, set powerful machine learning-based alerts, and collaborate with your team to resolve performance issues.
Datadog integrates seamlessly with more than 200 technologies, including Google Cloud Platform, AWS, Docker, PagerDuty, and Slack. Speaking of, With fast installation and setup, plus APIs and open source libraries for custom instrumentation, Datadog makes it easy for teams to monitor every layer of their stack in one place. But you don't have to take our word for it. Start a free trial today and Datadog will send you a free t-shirt. Visit datadog.com/complete developer to get started. Originally coined by Ward Cunningham, technical debt is the idea that there will be a cost in terms of more development work down the line for using certain solutions to problems that arise while developing. The whole idea is a metaphor comparing development to taking out financial debt. It's also related to refactoring, which is the idea of going into your existing code and making changes to improve the quality or readability or any number of factors. Technical debt can be used to predict the amount of work that refactoring your code will take. We have a quote from Ward Cunningham when he was introducing this. Shipping first-time code is like going into debt. A little debt speeds development so long as it is paid back promptly with a rewrite. And I do want to say here that this episode is not about finding hidden debt. Instead, it's about understanding what technical debt is and what it can do. And we're going to have more episodes on the topic that talk about various episodes of hidden debt or finding technical debt in your code base.
We're going to use a couple of systems to break down technical debt. First, we'll talk about the types of debt, then the sizes or how much debt you take on. Next, we'll discuss technical debt accumulation, looking at each type with each size of debt. Finally, we'll discuss paying off your technical debt. Throughout the episode, we're going to continue the metaphor using real monetary debt as an example for how to understand technical debt.
Yeah, as I was building this, at each level, I would put in, what it related to and then write that out later.
Yeah.
First off, we're going to talk about the types of technical debt. You can think of technical debt as falling into one of four quadrants where the x-axis is reckless to prudent and the y-axis is deliberate to inadvertent. It's kind of hard to describe this as an image. Google technical debt quadrant and you will get plenty of pictures of this because it's everywhere. The idea originally came from Martin Fowler in a blog post he wrote on technical debt, which we will link to in the show notes.
Yeah, so reckless debt would be something with high interest and long-term to pay it off, but little benefit. This is like taking out a huge loan for a really expensive car.
Mm-hmm. Whereas prudent debt would be something that is needed and can be paid off in a timely manner. So this would be something like medical bills or taking out a car loan
or a home loan or a business loan, something like that.
For a car loan for a car that is practical, it may have a couple bells and whistles because you like to spoil yourself and you can afford it.
But not like a crazy over-the-top expensive, I can't afford this, but I want to show out type vehicle. Inadvertent debt occurs when you're not expecting to take on debt or you do so without intending to.
Yeah, this would be like
emergency medical bills.
Yeah, like going to the emergency room or something comes up all of a sudden. You have a car wreck and you have to take out debt to buy a new car because you have to drive to work.
Yeah. And I mean, this could also be, inadvertent in the sense that, it could be through lack of paying attention as well. Sort of like getting a massive tax bill and having to get on a payment plan.
Right. Now, deliberate debt, on the other hand, happens for a reason. And this is when you or your team is aware that they're taking out this debt. So this is like me right now. I am saving up so that I can buy a home. And when I do, I will be taking out debt, but that will be deliberate debt. Right. Or going to college to get an education so you can get a good job. You are taking out deliberate debt when you do that with an end goal in mind, knowing that, hey, I'm going to have to pay this back.
Yeah. And that's, by the way, that's not any speech on whether your perception of the value of that debt is accurate or not. It's just you did it on purpose.
Yeah. The perception of value is the reckless to prudent.
Yes.
And it may, that may or may not be the case, but, so what this creates are 4 quadrants, and they can be termed naive, unavoidable, strategic, and Dunning-Kruger. And yes, I made up the last one because it was only the first 3. And we'll talk a little bit about why that one is we're not going to talk too much about it as we go along. The first one, though, naive technical debt, that occurs when you don't know the correct way to build or design your code.
Yeah, and that comes from being inadvertently reckless. So do you remember how you coded when you first started, right? Like early on, like 6 months in. Mm-hmm. If you built an app doing that, like you were hired by a company and you built an app for them, that would be naive technical debt. Like most of what you wrote would have been naive technical debt.
Yeah. You're going to see this mostly with junior developers, though senior developers aren't immune.
No, they're not. Senior developers get into it another way.
Yeah.
Is really what it comes down to. Like jumping to another language and then writing their code in that language as if it were in the first one. That's the biggest one that I see.
That reminds me of when I first started at my job and I was jumping between SQL, C#, and Angular. The lead developer that I was working with, which you guys have heard, Cody, has been on the show. He said to me several times, like, yeah, I can tell when you made the switch from C# to JavaScript.
Because you wrote C# in JavaScript for a while, basically.
Yeah. He's like, for about 10 to 15 lines of code, while you're working for the first hour or so, it's C# and JavaScript, and then you switch over.
Yeah. You also see this a lot with senior developers that are really good at like a middle tier language. Again, C#, Visual Basic, Java, those kind of things, when they write database code.
Yeah,
because they will write it procedural. It's like there's cursors everywhere, and SQL is set based, and you don't tell it how to implement things unless you just really have to. So that's the way that it manifests for senior developers.
Mm-hmm. I can see that. The next one is unavoidable technical debt, and this happens when things that are outside of your control add to the development process. This quadrant is created by the mix of inadvertent but prudent things causing this type of debt, and we're going to get more into it in a little bit, but they're necessary, however not expected and not planned for.
Like, for instance, you suddenly have to scale your app because you just took on a huge client, and sales landed a deal. It was a surprise. You weren't expecting it. You got to make decisions that make the thing scale. You might have to write some crap code just to get it out the door and land that client. And it can make a huge difference for the business, but you weren't involved in the planning.
Right.
So strategic technical debt occurs when there's a known reason to take on the technical debt and it's decided to do so. Now, that sounds a lot like the whole big client thing, but this is more looking forward, whereas the unavoidable is more like, oh crap, it's here.
This is basically the best category to be in because it's planned for debt with known costs and known benefits. So you know what you're getting out of that. So, when you buy a house, hey, I'm getting a place to live with building equity into it, that I will get something out of it, but I do have to pay into it on a regular basis. And that's what strategic debt is. These are things that are necessary and expected.
Yeah, and a lot of examples, there's tons of examples of this kind of stuff. Starting out with a data access framework that you don't necessarily like, but you're trying to get a product up so that you can show it to venture capitalists and maybe get some money in to actually have salaries. That's strategic technical debt. It's okay, as long as you don't overdo it.
I actually ran into some of this today, and we may talk a little bit more about it later, but I ran into a problem where something that we had been using was originally built as a proof of concept, and certain things like, some links that should be in the database were in the database, but they were also hard-coded into the UI.
Yeah, so you didn't have to mess with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Just to show, hey, this works. And then when we added a new thing to it, we put it in the database like it was supposed to be. Everything was there, and the links weren't working because they were hard-coded into the UI.
Yeah. And you'll run into a lot of this stuff, especially on small, nimble teams that are trying to get new stuff done. Like, this is all over the place.
So The final category, and we're not going to talk too much about this throughout the episode, is the Dunning-Kruger technical debt. And again, I made up this one. This occurs when you are deliberately reckless, believing that you don't have time or don't need to build your code correctly. This comes about through arrogance, poor management, external pressures. There's a lot of different things, but like I said, we're not really going to focus too heavily on this one throughout the episode because honestly, if you're in the Dunning-Kruger club, you know better than us anyways.
Yeah. Well, and you don't know you're in that club.
Well, yeah, the
definition.
Whole, yeah. So,
yeah. It's not our
the whole idea here is you think you know better, so you're purposefully not doing things because you think you know better.
And you can get it out quick.
Yeah.
That's really the main thing.
We're not really going to talk too much about that because there's not a lot that you can do for that.
So next we'll talk about the various sizes of debt because, there's a difference in dynamic between, just like look at your personal financial. If you owe the bank $100,000, the bank has got you in a bind. If you owe the bank $100 billion, you've got the bank in a bind, right? Like there's a different dynamic to how this stuff plays out, depending on how big the debt actually is in one area or not.
And we're going to break it down into short-term, mid-term, and long-term debts. So short-term debt, this is something that is intended to be taken on for an immediate use and then paid back in a quick or short time frame.
Right. And so this is stuff like hard coding links.
Yeah.
Because that's pretty easy to fix, probably, because if you're putting your links in a database and that's your common practice, you've already got code to pull those out. But it was quicker just to take this shortcut and get the thing out the door.
Yeah. You may do this because you have a sprint deadline coming down on you and you intend to pay it off in the next sprint.
Yeah. Or there's something broken at a client site and you just need to get a fix out.
Right.
And, get things where they're not on fire.
Mm-hmm. The goal here is for the debt to be small and easy to repay. In financial sense, the proper use of credit cards would be a great example of this.
Yeah, and I just did this Saturday night. I bought a new refrigerator, and I put it on the credit card. And it'll be getting paid off here in 2 weeks or something like that, when the next bill hits, because that's what I do.
Yeah, well, the proper way to use a credit card is to supplement until you can pay it off. So you take on a little bit of debt to get through a certain time period and pay it off at the end of the month or the end of that cycle.
And I just use it for cash flow management more than anything, because now I've got another month before that actually hits my account to kind of think about things. It's a way of creating space, which is what this stuff is.
And sometimes there's also external rewards like cash back or points that you earn from using your credit card. So you may get some external rewards for getting something out quickly and then come back and pay it off a little bit later.
Yeah, like you may save a sale, to a client, for instance, and then you look good in front of management, you get promoted. Now you're in a better position to fix all the debt. That became a productive asset for you. Midterm debt is taken out for larger things that are to be paid off on a regular schedule. This may be stuff like, changing out an API where you leave in a backward compatibility, the /v1/v2 APIs in your app because people can't move immediately. Yes, the old one is technical debt, but there's reasons you have to leave that in there for a little while.
Well, yeah, I did this. We're doing somewhat of a microservices architecture. And so when I rebuilt one of our microservices to match the new data model that they wanted for it, but we already had applications in production that were using it. So we had to build in some way of letting them continue to use it until they could be updated.
Yeah.
And that is technical debt. That is midterm debt where, all right, we've got 5 applications out there that need to be updated to use the new API.
But we cannot update them all right now.
Right. We don't have the staffing to update them all right now.
And get them deployed and get them tested all together while the system's running.
Exactly. So we're going to build in some technical debt of, hey, we've got backward compatibility. They still work, but we can go in one at a time and over the course of a year, get all 5 of them over to the new API. A monetary example of this would be something like your car payment. It's not a small debt that you take out.
More than likely.
Yeah, but you do pay it off incrementally. So you have a set time frame that you're going to pay it off in and set amount that you pay towards it.
Yeah, and with the goal of actually getting it done. Now, there are people that get car payments that they can't cover, or they're constantly paying a car payment, their entire lives. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about I'm getting a car payment as a way to bridge a gap.
Though I will say some of the cheaper cars that you can find are ones that were repossessed. So
yeah, there is that.
Finally, long-term debts are ones that can't be paid off quickly or easily.
And this is stuff like changing your framework or your language. I remember when .NET came out, all the Visual InterDev programmers and the Visual Basic programmers were in a tizzy because now they got to change all their code. And there's people out there that still haven't done that. I've got a pretty good friend that's in that boat right now that's got some Visual Basic 6 code. It still runs.
Yeah.
But, when he needs to get help on it, the number of those developers is thin, and it's a long-term thing that he's kind of stuck with.
Something more modern would be switching from AngularJS to Angular.
Yeah.
And I've taken several classes on making that transition because the newer apps, my team is the only one still developing AngularJS because back when we started the application, we built it, we built a part of it, and then we did something else, and we came back to build another part of it.
And you probably weren't on the component model or any of the other on-ramps either at that point.
We've moved to the component model. I'm actually getting to do some of the front end this week. It's kind of cool. I'm getting to build some components for it. But yeah, we're on the on-ramp, and the next project we take on is going to be Angular 5.
Nice.
But we're still building AngularJS on this one.
Yeah.
And all the other teams, and I'm working with our most senior front-end developer on this team, and he's guiding other people through doing what he really wants to do, and he was like one of the leading forces in bringing Angular in, and he's not getting to do it because he's on this application that was a bigger, more difficult application.
Yeah, and I'm in the process of switching web forms over. So I'm doing the whole thing of adding API controllers and JavaScript components, doing knockout more than anything else. But it's the same kind of thing. It's like this is not going to happen in a year.
Yeah, this is something that takes time. One of the big things that we're doing at work, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the how and when debt accumulates, which is next. But one of the things we're doing is replacing a lot of older systems, things that were built before you got into development, some of them. And we're replacing those with modern, newer technology. And so that doesn't happen overnight. That takes years and planning it out and going, all right, we're going to replace this system and then this system, and like a lot of scheduling and planning. Yeah.
And this stuff is more like a mortgage or your student loans. Like it's a long-term plan. I mean, like with your student loans, right? Or my mortgage, like that's, I think you said your student loans will be paid off in like 9 or 10 years or something like that.
Yeah.
My mortgage, I think is I know it's a 30-year. Now we're probably going to accelerate that and try to burn that down a little quicker because
a lot of people do.
Yeah. But I mean, you don't come in and just go, I'm just going to pay my mortgage off today.
Yeah.
That's not a thing. Unless you win the lottery, it's not happening.
This is something that's taken out for a big life event and paid off over a longer period of time.
Right.
And usually you celebrate when you pay it off. To be honest with you, I paid off one of my bigger student loans and I celebrated when that happened. I'm going to pay off the next biggest one towards the end of this year, and you and I are probably going to go out and celebrate after that.
Yeah. And I think it's important to remember too, if the debt is reasonable, like especially with technical debt, like the reason you're paying it off is because it worked. Like you didn't go bankrupt. You have debt because you're not bankrupt.
So the next section we're going to talk about is how and when debt accumulates. And we've kind of covered a little bit of this when we're talking about what the debt is. It's hard to differentiate what it is from how you get it, but we're going to go into a little bit more depth here, and we're going to break this down into different size debts. So your short, mid, and long-term debts. And for each one, we're going to talk about the different types. So we'll talk about naive, unavoidable, and strategic debt for each short, mid, and long term. Short-term debt comes about from a short-term or immediate need or a limited time frame to get something done.
Yeah, it's a naive short-term debt. Tends to happen a lot when you have junior developers writing code that's not reviewed by a more senior developer, although senior developers can make these mistakes too, especially when they're cutting corners and they're about halfway checked out.
Yeah. Usually it's because they're fixing a problem to the best of their ability and not planning for how that will be used in the future.
Yeah. And that's why it's so insidious when you especially get a senior dev that is checked out, because they know better and they're taking all the shortcuts that a senior dev is capable of taking because they know they're not going to be there to fix the problem anyway.
That is very true. And with the junior dev, and this is something that I am growing to learn as I'm in the mid range.
In other words, you're saying that you had to look at some of your old code, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Who checked this crap in? Oh, wait.
Yeah, I've said that many times. But I, as a journeyman, kind of mid-level developer, I'm looking at this and when I write code, I am thinking, all right, how will this be used in the future? And that's not something I thought about.
Well, you couldn't.
It's sort of a meta process that I didn't even know I should be thinking about early on. I was thinking, how is what I'm writing going to be used? Not how can this code evolve and be reused? One of the biggest things is when I stopped being in charge of maintaining one of the projects I was on and it went to another team. And then they were asking questions about things, and I had to explain why certain decisions were made.
Yeah, being a junior developer is very similar to being poor in a lot of ways, because you can't think about the longer term because you're not there yet. Like, you don't have the wiggle room.
Right. Unavoidable short-term debt happens when a requirement changes or you learn something new, but you don't have the ability to adjust the timeline. So this actually happened to us in the sprint I'm in right now. We had one story for a single form, taking a paper form and putting it online. And our baseline is a single form. So we gave it our baseline because, hey, it's a form. We're just taking this form. We're putting it online. What we didn't realize was how dense that paper form was.
Yeah. And you can't do that online because it's not accessible in Section 508.
And it became 7 pages to build that, and a massive object. I think I built 8 tables in the database just for one paper form.
Yep.
That's how dense that form was. And we didn't know until we got into it and started building it that we're like, oh, this is a lot more than what we expected.
And then you end up having to cram to try to get it all done.
Right. And that's where I'm at right now. This will happen if you don't have accurate acceptance criteria or if they change while you're developing, which they should never change. You create a new story, but
should.
Yeah, should is the main word there.
I've had them change during acceptance testing.
Yeah.
And it's like, just go ahead and write this and roll it on out. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, it never works. No.
This could also occur from not having enough time to write proper documentation or run the proper tests you need to do.
Strategic short-term debt is expected, and a plan is made for quickly repaying it once the reason for the need is no longer an issue. And the best example of this is coming across something that needs to be changed and creating a story for it to be done at a later time. Yeah,
this is like what I said, where what you should do if the acceptance criteria needs to change when you're in development, you get in there and you start asking some questions that you didn't think about during refinement, and they go, oh, that's not what we meant, but it's what it says in the acceptance criteria. You go ahead and build it that way, especially if you've already done it. You go ahead and use that because it meets the criteria, and you put a story in to fix it later. Yeah. So this is strategic short-term debt.
Yeah, and I would also think that that's something that comes about when you learn new things. Mm-hmm. I know you ran into that with the generic log callbacks that we went through on the whiteboard over here that you guys, I guess, are using successfully now.
Yes. Oh, yeah. This is a big thing. I love this. I got to show it off to our senior and lead developers, and they were like mind blown
Yeah.
Like, I was told, are you sure you're a junior developer? Like,
Yeah.
Yes, I am.
But I know this extremely lazy senior developer that doesn't like to type anything extra that he doesn't want to type.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've had to do that as well. Like getting like require.js and knockout and all that stuff, where I'm working, getting that stood up. Like I haven't gone back and fixed all the old knockout code.
Yeah. And with the generic log callbacks, I haven't gone and put those into all of the old code that I had where I was using the try catches.
Yeah.
I have a to do in each controller where those still exist that says replace old try catches with the new callback.
And of course, again, we didn't get into the Dunning-Kruger short-term debt. I've just seen so much of it. Like
I know there's a reason we're not getting into it because there's not really anything you can do about it.
Yeah. Because
you find out about it and you're like, all right, I have to deal with this, but it's not anything that you can control or mitigate.
Yeah. You only see it in the rear view mirror or in the driver's seat.
Right.
It's not on the road ahead.
Yeah. So next is your midterm debt, and that accumulates when major changes are needed in your code. Naive midterm debt happens due to a lack of understanding or lack of knowledge of good design principles.
Yeah, so like if you're making changes in multiple places just to add a field to a class, then you might want to consider refactoring. I deal with a lot of older code bases. I have for most of my career. And so there's a lot of programmers out there that, quite frankly, if I ever get the opportunity, I'm going to break the Control C and Control V on their keyboard. Because, I mean, like you go, oh, I got to change this one thing. This should only take an hour. And then you're like, I ought to search for this string and just see if it's anywhere else because I've got a bad feeling. And it's in 47 places, slightly altered. So you got to go look at every one of those and test every one of those. And by the way, it's web form, so you can't like unit test cleanly yet. Oh, so you're in there. I know.
I've had to deal with some of our older stuff that's in web forms, and testing it is not pleasant at all.
Yeah.
And I'm a big proponent of unit testing. So,
and you get a lot of this too with junior devs as they're learning things. With a senior developer, you call this resume-driven development because you will get that too.
Yeah,
that's how it manifests for seniors. But for junior developers, it's like, I just learned a better way to do this. They don't have time to go back and fix the other things because they're still working. And they tried something new, and they probably didn't get it right the first 8 times.
I can't see too much negative about this because I'm right there, and I'm mid-level, but I am still learning a lot of new things. And there's code in the code base I'm working in right now from when I would consider myself still junior.
Yeah.
That I have gone back and rewritten a couple of times already because I've learned a better way of doing it. Honestly, we just started using ReSharper at work. So I found a way to take 3 sets of stories and abstract out the core for what was needed in them and get all the API stuff done in about a week and a half that should have taken a 3-week sprint to do the whole thing. Yeah. So now I'm helping the front end to get a little bit ahead because I built everything unexpectedly faster thanks to learning some new stuff and a new tool. Yeah,
when you get new tricks like that, that's what happens, and you're not able to really go back and fix the old.
Right.
I've got stuff in the code base that I'm working on 2 years ago that I wrote, and now I look at it and I go, that's not optimal. It's not bad. It's not broken. It's just like, man, I don't like that. Well,
I talked to our senior front-end developer, who's the UI developer I work with, and I told him, I was like, hey, I'm done with my bit. Do you want me to go back and do some refactoring, or do you want me to help out on the front end? And he was like, I could really use your help on the front end. So I'm getting to do some front end work because of that. And it's awesome. I'm learning so much just this week from being able to work in it.
Midterm unavoidable debt comes about usually because of upgrades in tools and frameworks. This could be adding new services or updates to existing ones that require changes to be made in the current code base. So lots of stuff with backward compatibility can be this. Where I work, we're looking at reworking our logging for the entire app. We have logging statements in there, but there's a lot of that needs to be changed. And so this is a mid-tier thing because it wasn't it wasn't as thorough as it needed to be.
Well, it's like I was talking about earlier with that service that I wrote where we added that backward compatibility into it so that we could come in and we didn't have to go change 5 different applications that were using it all at one time and take all of them down from production to make this change.
Right.
This could also happen when the tools that you are using are updated with breaking changes. So something that we ran across with Angular was we weren't able to upgrade some of our applications to 1.5. Like we had to change in our grunt from the...
Oh, you're talking about like the version specifier piece where you use the, what is it? The symbol that looks like a hat.
Yeah.
The caret.
The caret versus the tilde.
I don't know why I always call that a hat. Because it doesn't look like a hat.
But we had to use the tilde.
Yeah.
To get a specific minor version of Angular because
if you use the other one, it goes up to the next major
version. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so they changed the routing in 1.5 and it did not work with what we were doing. And this was the very first app I was working on. So it didn't work with the way we had built our directives in that one. So we were not able to move up until we made changes in the application.
Yeah. So strategic TET in the midterm is when you build something a certain way, knowing that you will likely have to change it in the future. And this could be because of business requirements. You're coming down the pipe. It could also be that the tools necessary to build it the correct way are not available yet.
This is something that I've run into at work where using this microservices, we are told, hey, we're going to have this service and you need to integrate with this service, but it's not built yet.
Yeah. So stub it out.
So you gotta build in this technical debt to connect with this service when it eventually exists.
Yeah. And the one that gets me, because our software is white label, right? So it goes out to client sites. Some of our clients, for instance, are on Windows Server 2008 R2. Now, 2008 R2, I think it's R2, doesn't support WebSockets in the browser. And we've got some stuff that uses WebSockets. Right.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Or it doesn't support it on the web. It doesn't support WebSockets at the web server level.
Okay. Yeah.
So we had to do Signal R with with jQuery long polling for those. Okay. So we have the same model. Now, do we want this thing polling? But we have to put up with that until the clients move forward. And so that's a big thing that will happen to you too. It's like there's new tech that would be really, really cool to have. I can think of another example. I want the JSON support that's in SQL 2016. We have clients on 2008 R2. It's going to be a hot minute.
I understand.
Yeah. So you can't always do it the best way because you are not necessarily in control of the servers either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's like when we integrated database logging. I had it just fine on dev, but on our servers on the DMZ, it wasn't there because certain DLLs were not included.
Oh, you're talking about Oracle?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man, that
was a pain. You helped me out.
And the thing is I don't deal with Oracle day to day and have very rarely had to. But I'm deeply aware of those just from the times that I've had to do it because they don't like you pull in the Oracle DLLs in .NET, you get the NuGet package, but there's the other DLLs that those are calling and it doesn't put them there. Like, oh, you have to install our special client. It's like, is there any instruction here?
So finally, long-term debt comes from major overhauls in the technology that you're using, such as changing your framework or updating to a modern language.
You don't see as much of this in the naive quadrant with the exception of the occasional manager that doesn't understand what they're asking for in an overhaul. Of course, I will say that there is a naive way of taking this on. Where like right now, if you're still doing ASP.NET web forms, that's probably not always the best place to be. They say they're going to continue it, but there's a lot of the smell of discontinuation happening.
Yeah.
And so I would say that's how you get there in a naive way. It's a junior dev or a developer that is a expert beginner pushing you into it, or a really old dev that doesn't want to change their ways.
The other thing could be it's something that you've talked about in the past, which is changing for the sake of change, or a senior dev that wants to do resume-driven development because they want to get into it So they're not planning on sticking around, but they want to play around with it. So they bring it in.
And I worked with a guy like this that, and he showed me how to use WebSockets. He showed me all kinds of slick stuff early on. And he wanted to get into all this stuff. And then once he got it down, he left. And guess who got to maintain that for another month until I got cut? But, because they had all these downsizings anyway. So it didn't really matter. But that's kind of how that happens.
So this becomes unavoidable when you've been using an older technology that can't keep up with the modern world.
Yeah. And again, going back to the web forms example, like newer web form stuff can keep up with mobile, but the way most people that are still doing web forms write web forms, it can't.
The technology you built your business around may no longer be supported. Here's looking at you, Silverlight.
Or VB6 web classes.
Yeah.
Yeah, or Java, those little Java plugins. I think those are pretty much gone now.
Yeah, pretty much.
Or Flash is going.
Flash is going, though it's still being used because we used Flash today.
Yeah.
In this case, longer-term debt becomes an immediate concern that has to be addressed. But it has to be addressed strategically.
Right. You can't just drop everything and do that. I've worked at places where people have come in and said, oh, you need to fire all these developers and you need to immediately, just stop all development for 6 months. Don't do any sales and rebuild this entire product.
Yeah.
It's great when a guy comes in with like 2 or 3 days experience at a company and says that to management. On the plus side, if he's got any cool pins or a monitor you want, when they walk him out of the building, you're probably going to get them.
Well, I mean, it's one thing to say that as this would be a good idea.
Yeah.
It's another thing to say that as you should do this.
Yeah. What you do is if you're going to say that, you couch it and go, in a perfect world, here's what I would suggest, but we're not in a perfect world. So let's talk about how to triage this and straighten this mess out.
So the only place to effectively deal with long-term debt is in the strategic quadrant. This is where you plan to upgrade to a newer system or framework. I've already talked about how we're moving from AngularJS to Angular, and our newer applications are being built in it. But the application that I'm working on right now with our senior front-end developer is still in AngularJS because that's where it started. We weren't going to port this over. That would be poor planning.
Right. Instead, what you do is you start bringing in component classes and you start gradually switching it out until eventually there's such a small barrier that you can make the jump.
Exactly.
Which is what I'm doing with the web API and the MVC and all that kind of stuff. It's going to take me a while to get there, but you kind of have to go that way.
And in the longer term, like in the overview, the big picture of what I do for a living, where I work, I'm rebuilding older systems with newer, more sustainable, more scalable technologies. And, that's what we're doing. They have a strategic plan in place for replacing all of these older systems. We're doing it one at a time, team by team, rebuilding these. And in the process, we're changing the way that business is done. We had our product owner's manager in a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying, oh yeah, the reason we did this certain thing the way we did it was because 20 years ago, this was all done on paper and you had to quickly be able to see it in a file. We don't have to do things that way anymore. It's not important that system isn't important. It's what it represented that's important. And he's like, there's a better way to do this with computers and automating it. So I would rather us move that direction. And it's really exciting to have someone on the business side that wants that and understands that concept.
Yeah. So speaking of actually paying off the technical debt, the next thing to discuss is how to do that.
Right. And for this, we also broke it down into short, mid, and long term. Your short-term debt is going to be the easiest to pay off, but it's also the easiest to avoid.
Yeah, and most of it comes from a need for a quick short-term benefit with little cost, and you should pay it off as quick as possible. So use the credit card to buy a fire extinguisher to put the fire out before it burns your house down. That's okay, But you shouldn't still be paying that credit card debt 20 years from now.
Or, use the credit card to pay your emergency room bill and then pay it off. Even if it takes you a couple of months, pay it off in a couple of months. I will say, all right, talking about debt, I'm going to admit I had some medical bills that I've been paying on because interest free.
Yeah.
And so I've been paying on for a while. Well, I got my tax return recently and I just paid off all of those because by doing that, that saves me a lot of money per month that I can then put into savings.
Yeah. And short-term technical debt, if you leave it in the code base, it will metastasize because code reuse is a core thing. So you may have written something in a crappy way and it was real quick, but if you leave that there, a junior dev is going to come behind you and use that everywhere, and they're going to copy it all over the code base.
This could mean you need to create a story for it, especially in an agile environment, or handle it as soon as development is completed. So you got a client that is on fire. You go and you put in the quick fix to get them back up and running. And then in the next day, or, let's say you stay up all night, the 2 days later, when you go into the office, then you start looking at, all right, how do we fix the problem? You want to build into your development cycle some time to address the short-term technical debt so that it doesn't accumulate. And one thing that we haven't talked about is interest and what happens when these short and mid-term debts start to accumulate and you're not paying them off. And that's going to come in a later episode when we talk about some of the problems around technical debt.
So midterm debt takes a bit more effort and planning than short-term debt. You may not be able to address this immediately or pay it all back at once. This is the sort of stuff that's too big to go in one sprint. Mm-hmm. If you've got a longer release cycle, it still probably won't fit because you probably didn't create it in this. Like you have bigger chunks is essentially what happens. So it will not get paid off in a release cycle that it wasn't created in. In other words, of the same length.
This is like the medical bills that I had from the last time I had a kidney stone. Now, mind you, I've only had 2 kidney stones, but I ended up in the hospital, staying overnight, going through like all the process of finding out what it was and fluids and all that. So I had a pretty hefty hospital bill that I had to pay off. And I paid off over the course of a couple of years. But I had a plan and I paid a certain amount every month. The idea is these are larger debts, bigger things that happen that you have to pay off incrementally. And you build that in. The example that we've kind of been using throughout this episode is the one that I have of that API we changed. You get 5 different line of business applications that use the same service. You set aside time to change each one individually. Right. So you change one and then you go back to your regular work. And then as you see some time coming up in the future, you go, all right, I'm going to set aside these 2 days to work on this. And I'm going to pull this application and fix it and update it so that it goes with the new API.
Right.
And you set a time limit to do that by.
And the other thing too is you're on a team where your timelines are a little bit more controlled by you. If you're doing estimation, it is okay to pad for this a little bit so that you can actually fix problems in an area that you're working in.
I would suggest padding no matter what.
Yeah.
Because problems are going to come up that you didn't expect.
Yeah, but especially if it's an area that's got known technical debt.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I just got burned by this technical debt and I fixed it in this one little slice. Like, that's a superior solution to not having the padding and being just stuck and going over.
Yeah. Another option is to designate a certain time frame or sprint to addressing the accumulated debt. Because when short-term debt accumulates and builds interest, it becomes midterm debt.
Yeah. And the same with midterm and long-term.
Right. Speaking of which, the last thing we're going to talk about is paying off long-term debt. It takes a lot of planning and usually involves software architects and management. Your average developer that's in the trenches isn't likely to make the plans on how to address major changes in the company.
Right. I mean, this is almost the point where you're, financially, you would be looking at a financial advisor type person to get in there. Or, you're going to start talking to accountants and tax attorneys and, all those kind of shenanigans. It's not a short-term thing.
Right. Now, that said, your average developer, senior developer, may be involved in those decisions or be able to suggest or influence them. Like, one of the things I love about my job is I can walk into our executive director's office at any time and sit down and talk to her about our strategic goals and say, hey, I've had an idea that will help us reach these faster or do this better. And she'll sit and listen to it. And that may change the direction that we go.
Yeah.
Not likely, but I may influence.
Yeah.
And she'll listen. And I like that about the job I have, because I've been told that's not the case.
Common.
Yeah.
Most places. I've got that where I work as well. It's some of that is a trust thing too.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something you have to kind of build up to, but yeah, it's going to take more people and more time and more planning. It's like if you have a high interest credit card debt of $1,000 at a typical developer salary, you can pay that off pretty quick.
Right.
If you have a high interest credit card debt of $100,000 on a typical developer salary, you cannot pay that off quickly. You have to restructure the debt so that you can get at it and actually start working it down. And that's sort of the metaphor here.
Speaking of the metaphor, the idea here is not to avoid accumulating technical debt, but instead to understand what it is and how it can be used properly to benefit your development and your business. A quick fix has costs down the line, and understanding that can help you make decisions about how to build your applications. Accumulation of technical debt causes poor documentation, inaccurate tests, and a plethora of to-do comments. Knowing what you're getting yourself into when taking on technical debt helps you better plan for paying it off before it gets out of hand. That pretty much wraps us up. Before we close everything out, Will, what do you have for us this week for Tricks of the Trade?
Well, I want to talk about a personality type to avoid. And I don't know exactly what you would call this, but I'm going to describe it. And I like to refer to it as the secret king. And that is an individual that believes that they are, awesome, great at what they do. And if people just recognized it, they would put them in charge of things. I'll tell you, for the most part, this kind of individual is completely deluded, and you really need to be much more careful in how you deal with them. And there's a lot of historical examples of this. It never really ends well, but basically the idea is that if you can't make other people see your value, that's a problem with you, not a problem with them. And you really want to avoid these sort of individuals, because what tends to happen is that this worldview produces a lot of rage over time. BJ and I have both dealt with individuals like this at various points in our lives that thought that they were the absolute bee's knees, and that if everybody just recognized it, they would be in charge of things. But I've noticed some of the people that I know that are around this situation are trying to either talk to the individual or go, yeah, you're great. And they very clearly don't think the person's great. And it's going to blow up in their face. And I'm just watching it on Facebook, and I'm going to sit back and laugh because I already told them, don't do this. You're crazy. And so I just want to throw that out there. Like, if you see somebody doing the whole secret king routine, keep your distance. It's not worth it. That's all I got.
Stand by for Titanfall.
If you have a question or comment, please email us at neckbeards@completedeveloperpodcast.com. Our theme music is an excerpt from Stand By for Titanfall by Pure Bells, available on SoundCloud and licensed through Creative Commons.
The intro music for IoTs is Hillbilly Hip Hop by Jason Belcher. For references, show notes, and to sign up for weekly emails with extra tips and insights, be sure to check out the website at CompleteDeveloperPodcast.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at CompleteDevPod and like our page on Facebook to keep up with news about the show. Catch us each week as we broadcast live, talking about what's going on in the tech world and answering listener questions.
Learn more about all of our shows and groups by going to CompleteDeveloperNetwork.com, where you'll find links to Junior Developer Toolbox, Developer Launchpad, and our other communities. Thanks for listening. See you next time.